Hello, guys. We are back with not the Passion Project, now SaqerPunch. Okay, so that's the name of our podcast. That's what we're here for. And today, we have mucho very special guest. We have President Holloway himself from Rutgers, New Brunswick. Hashtag best school. They gave me a free iPad. So any school that gives you a free iPad, they're a keeper. About President Holloway. He is he majored in American Studies. He specialized in African American Studies. He was a dean at Yale, so he was a joy to talk to. We went into different topics about history himself, how his views on New Jersey, how he feels, what Rutgers is like to him. So I feel like you guys will enjoy watching it. I enjoyed having the conversation. And let's get into the video. Hello, President Holloway. How are you doing?
I'm just fine, thanks. How are you?
Good. How's this pandemic treating you? What's keeping you busy?
Oh, that's a broad question. I mean, the pandemic, personally, I'm healthy, so that's great. I get tested on a weekly basis since I live in a university building. My family gets tested. So, from a personal standpoint, we're okay. But, this is a tough time for every single person. I mean, people are affected in their own personal health, their extended family, their networks, the finances, you name it. It's a tough situation, certainly unlike anything in my lifetime.
I don't think anything in my lifetime. I don't think it's going to be anything in my lifetime will be as much as this.
Let's hope. Yeah.
Hopefully we'll
get through it. Especially in terms of the effects too, like the landslide effects coming in the next few years as well. Yeah, it's not only this 1 year affected. There's going to be small businesses and all these little kinks of all, like, the economic part of the economic part of America itself is going to be impacted for years to come.
Oh, it's not doubt about it. I mean, not just that, but when I was announced as president in January 21st, we had heard of the virus. I don't know if it was even named yet, but we didn't know yet that it was already in the country, of course. But like 6 weeks later, as New Jersey was shutting down, you were sent home. It was clear. No, it wasn't clear. Well, it was clear that trouble was coming. I just didn't know the scale or the scope of it, right? And once we started to understand better what was happening, I'm like, wow, this is going to take years to recover from. Even if now, I don't think any of us thought we'd have like these really promising vaccines within 6 months. That's nuts. Hopefully they are truly as great as the promise is.
Hopefully, yeah.
But if they can deliver, we'll be on the other side of the medical part of the crisis by and large by next fall, which is kind of stunning. But and the revenue streams at Rutgers will open up again and things will start to feel much better. But we will still be in a hole for another couple of years just to come out of it. So, and we're a huge enterprise. And so it's sobering to think about it. My presidency is fundamentally different than the one I accepted. And that's just the fact of it.
Yeah, and there's really nothing you can do about it as well. Like, it's just going with the situation as well. And I think—
Thanks for reminding me.
That's not what I meant exactly.
I know.
I was kind of leading up to that. How do you think that you kind of pushing the semesters to online, how do you think that's going to affect students later on? How do you think that's a stepping stone to the future of this university?
Yeah, I'm nervous and hopeful about it. I mean, the nervous part is the more obvious part. I mean, my first public decision as president is to say, yeah, we're not going to actually meet in person in the fall. That was fun. And my email inbox reflected, the complicated nature of that decision. That too was fun. But I still believe it was absolutely the right decision for the health and safety of everybody involved. Now, the short-term effect of that has been an extraordinarily challenging situation. I mean, look, you both understand. Well, I guess for Ahmed, this is your first-year student, right? So This is a little bit more abstract for you because you only know Rutgers this way. But so much of college, I mean, a lot of it is critical about research and teaching and being in that classroom. But so much of it is all the social networking that you're developing. I mean this in a very serious way, like all the relationships you're building, all the things you're learning about that are extracurricular or co-curricular that we can't do, right? So the notion of what a college experience is for a quarter of the students, they're going to have to learn it from scratch next year, really. And that itself will have interesting effects on like engagement on in what I'll call community aspects, whether it's clubs or organizations or whatnot. So we'll see. We know it's going to have a huge effect. What it is, we'll see. I do think when we come back in person, there'll be an incredible exuberance about being back in person, which will be interesting to experience. Like I've never been at Rutgers with students on campus. I mean, that's—
Me neither.
Yeah, well, yes. Sorry, I don't mean to make that point.
No, you're fine. Honestly, to me, it's exciting to know what it's going to feel like. Like the idea of maybe next fall going back in person, finally feeling that college experience makes me kind of excited. So I definitely know what you mean.
We're coming back in the fall. We are building our plan for be back 100%. It'll be different. There'll still be a lot of mask wearing, I'm sure. You know, the big lectures will probably still be online, but just because of how you've managed people getting in and out of buildings. But we'll be back. And I think people are going to lose their minds in the best way. I mean, that is going to be like, yes, here we are. And I'll be at the front of that queue because, you know, I didn't come here to be a president sitting in the study of my home and managing the university from this room. That's not what I signed up for, of course. So I'm eager to meet the students in person as well. You know, going back though to the previous question, the weird potential upside is that universities in general are very slow moving. It's hard to get universities to change. But in 2 weeks across the nation, universities shut down and went remote. And then by and large kept their pedagogy and practice moving forward. Was it different? Of course it was different, but they still moved things forward. And teachers are getting better and better at navigating that space. Students are getting better at learning how to navigate that space. It's far from perfect, but it's better. So on the other side of it, we at Rutgers and at many other universities will have learned a lot about potential new models, whether for its mixed classroom, whether it's for how to do remote education better so that we can open up our doors further to adult learners or, you know, people working full-time taking evening classes more than we do now, because there's a whole other way of adding capacity because we have Zoom classes. Again, we don't want this to be the majority of our classes, not by a long shot. We're an in-person university, but we've learned a lot. And I don't think we had better take advantage of what we learned of in this process to grow Rutgers as far as potential populations it serves.
I agree. I feel what we're in now is a moment in history. Like online and social media is always a joke about it. For example, that people will look back at this time and laugh at, like what the coronavirus was, but we're living in a time in history.
Oh, yes, you are.
And so and this is especially down your expertise, right? You studied American history, specifically African American studies, if I'm correct, right?
Yeah.
And so how do you feel in terms of that scope, in terms of American history? How impactful will this be in history, and why is it overall that you chose American history or history in general? Because personally, I'm a world history kind of guy, but so it's interesting to why people pick American history in that sense.
Yeah, well, those are two very different questions. Let me answer the first one. Moving away from like why did I pick this? I'll get back to that, but to what do we make of this moment? I mean, global pandemic, economic upheaval, political chaos, and social unrest at a level that has literally never existed before in terms of social activism, all in the same 4 months. I mean, are you kidding me? I mean, no one has gone through this. Now, I've not gone through war in the way that other generations have. And so there's things I haven't done, but no one's gone through this. So what comes out on the other side, I mean, the historian in me is fascinated by what is going to be the first draft in 20 years, frankly. You know, we'll get a lot of the journalistic drafts, but like in 20 years, when we know a lot more about, the opportunities we missed in terms of trying to, I mean, look, the US has handled this whole thing really poorly because it was politicized. It was the last thing that should have happened as far as the health and welfare of this country. But we'll know a lot more in time about what was really happening behind the scenes. So that part, I'll be curious to read those books in time. But those are not the books that are going to come out in the next 5 years. That's just first draft stuff. As far as me getting into history, I mean, I majored in American studies in college, but that was only after I had, which, and back then is a very simplified notion. That was like a third of my classes were English classes, a third of my major was English classes, a third were history, and a third were political science. There you go. You got American studies. We don't do that model anymore, which is a good thing, but that's what it was. So I was taking like history light in a way. And I loved that major. It was great. But it wasn't until my senior year in college, 6 weeks before I graduated, quite literally 6 weeks, when a professor pulled me aside. I was doing an honors thesis with him. And it was my first sustained research project. And I was enjoying it. And then he pulled me aside and he asked what my plans were. And I mean, had that deer in the headlights look. Like I had all these different ideas, none of them worked out. Or you know, I had this public policy fellowship for a year. I grew up in the DC area. So I'm like, I'll go into public policy, not knowing what aspect I'd even want to do. It's just like, it was, for lack of a better idea. But 6 weeks before I graduated, he said, you know, what are your plans? I don't know. Have you thought about getting a PhD in history? No, you should. Why? Let's talk. I mean, it was really that kind of conversation. I'm being completely honest here. We're on Friday. Yeah, earlier this week, this same professor and I were exchanging emails still. That was 31 years ago. And we are still in touch. And so I got into history not because, I mean, I'd already liked the topic, but it wasn't my profession. But a professor saw something in me and said, you can do this. I'm like, really? And so I started investigating it. And for me, to be honest, this is 21-year-old Jonathan. I'm like, and I was at college at Stanford, so it's always mild. I'm like, this professor wears blue jeans and a polo shirt. Like, why wouldn't I want to go into this line of work? That's awesome. I mean, that was about as deep as I was. It was like, but I thought like, yeah, you could do what you want and you can study what you want. And there's some truth to that. And there's some things that are not true. It's a bit naive. But when I started grad school, 15 months later, within a month, I'm like, yeah, this is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. This is amazing, really hard, but like amazing. So it wasn't my idea. I fell into it. Just like I fell into African-American studies. And then it became the thing I wanted to do more than anything else.
No, that hits home for me, right? Because I'm undecided at the moment. And I'm kind of exploring, but definitely hearing people decide or how they came to decide what they wanted to do in life is always intriguing to me. So I appreciate hearing that from you.
I'm glad you're undecided. That I actually, unless you're like a chemistry major where you have to, or an engineering major where you have to get in right away and take those courses, I'd much rather students be undecided in that first year. Explore.
Exactly. For me, it was. I like so many things, and I couldn't say that I didn't want to give one up, and that's what it is for me. I want to take a history class. I want to take an English class. My English class right now is my favorite class. To be honest, it's a heroism. Wendy Schwartz. Have to plug her.
Shout out.
Definitely love the class. So it's that's what it is for me. It's going out and exploring. And in your exploration of history, for example, what is it that you would say is your biggest lesson or biggest takeaway from what you've learned?
I don't know if I've ever been asked that question. The biggest lesson. Well, the first thing that came to mind is that there are no saints and there are no sinners. I mean, in terms of like a pure person, like people that we venerate now, they had all kinds of weaknesses and failures and things that we, would like, oh man, you did that? That's kind of creepy, So we put people on pedestals, especially like primary and secondary school history classes, put people on pedestals, the founding fathers, for example. Martin Luther King, an amazing person, deeply flawed individual at the same time, right? What the study of history has taught me is that That's the thing that makes it special, is that, you know, human beings with certain gifts, whether it's intellect, strength, money, whatever it is, intuition, empathy, that they tap into those gifts, they work really, really hard, and something special happens, or they try to make something special. And the reason I like taking people off their pedestal is not to shame anybody or throw them under a bus or anything. It's to make them accessible. You know, because if we only think about King on a pedestal, no one is going to be like King. It's impossible. No one's going to be like, I don't know, pick your hero. No one's going to, no, that's unreachable. But they're all humans. They're all frail. They all have egos. You know, they may be funny, hysterical, kind of jerky. I mean, they may be all these things, right? And yet they did something that's memorable. And those are the things I take from history that are, I think, pretty exciting, because it just makes history more alive, and where one could imagine yourself in history. You just can't see it yet because you won't know for 20 years.
Going off of that, like, yeah, so going off of that, there was an example with Mother Teresa, how she herself had a lot of flaws that were revealed after her accomplishments were kind of accounted for. Yes. And so that kind of like brings to the point that it's important to humanize these people, because without that, without knowing that there are flaws with these people, they're just going to be unreachable. There's no second person that can kind of be the next Mother Teresa.
That's right.
There can be, another person.
We were discussing the same thing in class. Because my class is
class on heroism.
Yes, class on heroism. So thus, the quote that I think surmises it the most, and I'm paraphrasing at this point, but Malala said, people expect Mandela or Martin Luther King to come out of the ground when all of us are here to be heroes. It's something on the lines of that, right? Yeah. And it's we put people in inhumane positions in terms of they're way higher than they're supposed to be, and that's maybe at some points they deserve a kind of reverence. But they are human beings just like us, and it's an inspiration that we can know in the back of our minds that we can all reach that one point at one point.
You know, if I could just add to it, I mean, the one thing I want to emphasize though is that very rarely do people luck into the thing for which they become really famous, that they've worked really hard in some sort of way, or they have some gift that a circumstances is forced upon them, and then that gift is uncovered. Like that's Malala's story. I mean, and reducing it radically, of course, but there's got to be some thing that drives an individual to do something remarkable. And I mean, I was for a long time taught this post-emancipation African-American history course. And when you get to the modern civil rights movement, students would be talking about how they would never have, I put it in a positive, they would have been at the front lines of all these different protests. I'm like, really? I mean, I teach this stuff. I believe this stuff. I'm like, I highly doubt I would have been on the front lines, because being on the front lines means risking your job or your parents' jobs, or risking getting beaten up, or risking all these different things. Like the people who did these amazing things in the modern civil rights movement were driven by an astonishing amount of passion or anger or frustration or sense of justice that was unusual. And it was a minority of the population. I mean, it was a small amount of people in the grand scheme of the population who are pushing this rock uphill, which makes them that much more like really impressive. And frankly, when we think of some of these most famous leaders of the movement, I mean, you guys are about, let's say average around 20, you're close to 20, right? Right. Yeah. They had already done their great work. It's like, so are you telling me that when you were 15, you would have done this? I don't know. It's just, I don't want to take things away from people, but I want to make sure while I'm taking the heroes off the pedestal, still recognize they are special. There is something really different about them, but at least they're closer to us. And that's the thing that I think putting them in arm's reach is the important thing.
And I think especially the protests that happened within the past couple months emphasize that most. The amount of people that went out
Yes.
shows that every single person can make that difference.
That's right.
And that's why, do you feel, right, that these protests are in the same kind of spectrum as the civil rights era, that they emphasize an importance for people to go out there and make a physical change?
Oh yeah, I mean, I really do. The thing is, people often refer to the civil rights era like as the movement, right? You've all heard that. And I've said the same phrasing myself. It wasn't one movement. I mean, there were lots of different leaders, lots of infighting, lots of inconsistencies. It'd pop up here, it'd pop up there. It was remarkable that it cohered enough that people could, in time, make sense of it as a movement. So that's pretty remarkable. The thing with when Black Lives Matter really began to pop up in 2015, ballparking, on the national scene, that is. I was of the mind thinking, okay, well, this is interesting, really interesting and challenging, these hashtag politics, but like, what is it really doing? I mean, I don't get what it's doing. Well, look what it did. Here are in 2015 or 2020, I'm sorry, and it created the world's largest movement and was increasingly coherent about the things that it was calling for. And whether you agree with them or not, you can't deny those facts. So I think, we start getting the first draft of this history really in a way that I think will be substantive. That's really about 5 to 10 years away. There's going to be some really interesting things to talk about, how these cell phones created opportunity. Well, think of Arab Spring, same kind of thing. Toppled regimes, and also invited a lot of repression as well, as people got very afraid that they might be toppled. That this is not just a bunch of 16-year-olds who, instead of going on TikTok or spending a few more times doing a hashtag something or other, it's much bigger than that. And the fact that, you had literally individuals in very remote and homogenous places holding up Black Lives Matter signs, the only person in their town. I mean, that's a movement. I mean, those were acts of astonishing bravery, frankly, truly astonishing bravery. So I think, and in terms of the BLM, getting people motivated to push for police reform, motivated to get certain people put into office or out of office, that's a movement. It's just it has a different kind of coherence than the ones that we saw that brought us into the 1960s. That's okay. That's more than okay. I think that's evolution.
Right. And like, even in the magazine that Rutgers published the other day, like, I think you said something along the lines of Floyd's murder kind of made it really easy to talk about all these situations right now.
Yes.
So, like, in terms of that, do you think that people, like, why do you think that people live in a certain bubble within themselves that they feel uncomfortable talking about situations like these? Like, why is it that it takes someone's murder to kind of reflect back on these topics every 2-3 years?
Well, first, I mean, you all have come of age, meaning between ages 14 to the present, during a remarkable series of events in terms of heightened awareness to these kinds of issues. Mm-hmm. That's a huge change in your lifetime. That, the closest thing I can relate to that is that you've come up in an era where the idea of marriage equality, while contentious in many places, is also not a big deal. I find it astonishing. I'm all for it. But when I think about where we were when I was your age to where we are now, which is 30 years difference, the amount of change we've seen when it comes to what I'll call sexuality consciousness, politically, economically, socially, is just hard to imagine. And you guys see it as that's a normal part of life. On the negative side here, you've seen as a normal part of life, viral videos of, in this case specifically, Black men and women being murdered. That was not part of my life. Now, it's always been there, but the videos weren't part of the lie. There wasn't evidence around. So it's a different set of consciousness that you're dealing with. When I said that, talking about Floyd or the tragic murder of George Floyd meant it was easy for me to talk about things, is because that there is still the presumption that a Black person knows Black things, whatever that means. And so as a Black professor, look, I teach in African-American studies. That's where you see most Black faculty still. They work on this topic because most people work on things that are really interesting to them. Go figure. Talking about race is really interesting to me. But being the first Black president of Rutgers, having been the first Black provost at Northwestern, the first Black dean of Yale College, there is a challenge that comes along with being first, is that people presume you are going to care more about your firstness than like your affiliate group. And there is for me at least, speaking personally, for me, it's always been a challenge. Like at Yale, I was everybody's dean. I represented all undergraduates. As provost, I was everybody's provost. And that's really a faculty-facing position. As Rutgers president, I'm everybody's president. So if I start being seen as, oh, he only cares about Black students or Black faculty, that actually cuts me off at the knees. Like, I do care about Black students and Black faculty, of course I do, but I care about many other things too. And it's all of those things together that are important to my presidency. Now, so if I were to come out of the gate talking about social injustice and racial injustice and so on and so forth, without all this turmoil that you guys have been experiencing visually firsthand for the last handful of years, most intensely with George Floyd, be like, oh, that's what this guy is all about. So, he's going to be the race president. And while I will still be advocating for things that happen to deal with race, that's the stuff I work on as a professional. This is the stuff I care about as an individual. The tragedy and the awareness of it allows me to do it without people going, why is he talking about this? Everybody knows why I'm talking about this now. Yeah. I mean, you can't help but know it. You can still disagree with me, but at least you understand, oh, this is something kind of important. Now, the last thing I'll say, the reason why I think this resonated so loudly, George Floyd's murder, Breonna Taylor's murder, Ahmaud Arbery's murder, why it resonated so loudly is because we were all in pandemic lockdown. All of a sudden, people all across the country were inconvenienced. And they had time on their hands. And for many of them, they didn't know where the next meal was coming from, which was a new feeling for them. Or they're out of a job. They don't know what that's going to mean. How long will insurance, support me? There was a historic number of people who felt the inconvenience of being insecure. But that's an experience that Black folks have every day, that Black and brown folks have every day, that gay people have every day, that women in other ways have every day. And so there was this moment where like, oh my God, I don't like feeling insecure. I don't like this anxiety. And all of a sudden there was this connection, like that could have been like my friend, that could have been me, that could have been whatever. So you take all these things together, you get a change in mindset, you have a new platform for someone like me to say something about these topics. And who knows what the future holds coming out of all of that.
Do you think that because of how we were in lockdown, how we had a lot more time to focus on these issues, do you think that this protest, like this couple last months, would that resonate strongly, or is that gonna like kind of fizzle out like how the rest of the protests have been in the past few years?
I think this is different. I think the scale of this is different. I'm oversimplifying here. In the first era of Black Lives Matter protests, you saw Black people protesting. In this era, you saw everybody protesting. That's the difference. That's the difference. And so, and you saw it literally all over the world.
Right.
You can't put that back in the bottle. Will it be diminished? Yeah, of course it will. People will get distracted. They'll be back in their jobs. They'll be back in school. They have other things to do. But this has fundamentally changed things. I'm certain of it. Now, how? I don't necessarily know. Curricula will look differently. will look different in terms of what we're teaching in schools. I think sensibilities will have shifted, certainly. Now, some people will dig in further. They'll be more determined to refuse these things. But I think there'll be more people and more allies who are trying to push forward.
Yeah, no, that makes sense for sure. I also want to talk about your book because I find this really interesting. The Jim Crow Wisdom, Memory, and Identity in Black America since 1940. I wanted to ask, like, why 1940? Because 1960 is usually what I associate with the civil rights movement, what we've been taught in history books and all that. So why 1940?
Well, you just hit the nail partially on the head, is that, the work is trying to destabilize narratives. The movement, people started in 54 with Brown v. Board of Education. They could look at Little Rock. They could look at Montgomery bus boycott, all these things, 1950s phenomena. And those are like the most famous ones. And then in the 60s, you're in the heart of the movement. Fact is, there are very strong and clear connections to the 1960s that go back to the 1950s, 40s, and 30s, even to the 20s. Very easy argument to make. Now, for me, the 1940s there are a whole number of events that were cohering in the late 30s, early 40s that allow me to use that as a starting point. I mean, part of the answer is you got to start somewhere, right? I mean, there has to be a rationale for it. And for me, there were protest events in like 1939 and the establishment of what became the March on Washington movement in 1941 that ends up being honored in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. There are straight line connections. I mean, it's literally the same individuals for a lot of these things. So, for me, it was easy to make the argument of 1940 because shifting sensibilities and mentalities in the United States with Black and white Americans, just to simplify the country, that's a starting point. We can start there because something different has happened. And I think in the future, people will look at 2020 and saying something different happened. And they'll start making connections to, BLM and then other individuals, and we'll see what comes from that.
And that's why personally I like history, because there's so many takes and so many point of views. Like for me, and world history for me, like it's kind of dramatic, so that's why I like it, right? But somebody can look at the medieval times and say, well, this was the age of plague, or someone can look at it, this is the age of knights. And that's what's so intriguing to me. So when me and Praneet were discussing the questions, and he had mentioned, he's like, he started at 1940, and I was like, wait a second, 1940?
Like, what happened then?
Yeah. Where's the correlation there? And that's why I find history fascinating. And although, like I said, American history to me is only 200 years long. It's interesting to an extent, but I definitely understand your take on it. And a little birdie told me that there is a book that we should be looking forward to on your end. So if we can hear a little bit about that, that'd be outstanding.
Sure. So this book comes out in literally in 2 months. February 4th is when it's released. And the way what this means is that it's available like a month earlier. So the book will be in my hand in early January, I expect. Maybe before the end of this year, we'll see. And it's called The Cause of Freedom, a Concise History of African Americans. Now, I write short books short in a historian's world is a book that, if you include the index and everything and notes, around 300 pages. That's a short book. And I was approached 5 years ago, let's say, about then, by a press, Oxford University Press. Would I contribute to they have this huge series called A Very Short Introduction to fill in the blank, particle physics, macroeconomics, world history. And they probably was one as big as world history, but very arcane topics. And each of the books has the exact same structure, that you're allowed 150 pages manuscript, double space, 12-point font, 1-inch margins. Like these are all the rules you get when writing papers. Authors get the same rules. You get 150 pages max. You get 8 images. You get 2 tables. That's all you get. Tell us everything we need to know on this topic in that period of time, in that space. So I was approached about it, and I do post-emancipation U.S. history. So this is 1863 to the present. And I'm really a 20th century specialist. And this editor said, would you consider contributing to this series, doing African-American history? I'm like, oh, so you mean, well, one, I'm kind of busy as an administrator. I doubt I'll have the time, but tell me more. So, and they explained more. I'm like, so you mean the post-emancipation experience? And she said, no, all of it. I'm like, wait a second. You want me to go back minimally to the early 17th century and bring it to the present in 150 pages? She said, yes. Like, that's impossible. I mean, I'm writing 300-page books on something over like 40 years. And even then I feel like I'm skimming over the topic. So long story short, obviously she talked me in, convinced me to doing it. And for this particular series, there are some titles that they think will be in demand by a larger reading public. So the book is repackaged as a concise, a cause of freedom, the cause of freedom, a concise history of African Americans. And frankly, I finished it a year ago, thereabouts. And then all these things started happening in the country. And book production is slow. Right. And they said, okay, because the queue was like a year or two out. Said, all right, given what's happening, we're going to move this book to a different part of the queue. So it's supposed to be released a year from now, November 21, or October 21. And they pulled some book out of the queue and put mine in its place. So my book comes out in February, which also, Black History Month, of course, that makes sense. But they wanted to push it out to get closer to the demand for this kind of topic. So I never thought I could write a book that short on a topic that big. And one of my biggest challenges, once I figured out how to not write about things, then it started to free me up because there's just so many things to talk about. So if you're talking about the history of African Americans in this country, Abraham Lincoln, really important figure in that history. Thomas Jefferson, really important figure. These are iconic, of course we know who these people are. So you don't necessarily need a lot more attention, but you need to talk about them because they're really important to their histories. I think Lincoln got a half a page. Jefferson got 3/4. And definitely not in the way that people would expect to hear about Lincoln or Jefferson. And it's like, how do you do that? I mean, that's like crazy, but that's just what had to happen. I mean, so, at the end of the day, and in fact, my book, the first enslaved Africans show up in 1619. My book goes back to, at least 100 years earlier than that, when we have the first records of Africans in what is now North America. But yeah, somehow I pulled this thing off. It's pretty, I like it, but I'm a little biased. And it turned out to have been a fun project, and we'll see what happens. It's definitely not a book that I wrote as president. It is a book I wrote as provost, which is kind of shocking. Half of it is built on old lectures I've given. The other half is brand new. So we'll see what people say.
We'll definitely look forward to reading it. And we did have
available for pre-order on Amazon right now.
There's the shout out, guys. We have one last ace up our sleeves, we can say, and we've gathered some random fun facts about you, and we thought you could ask you about them and get a little bit from you about them. So,
all right,
main thing, right? We heard you met Senator Cory Booker in college.
Yes.
How? I don't understand. So can you tell us a little about that?
Well, he wasn't a senator yet. So, so Senator Booker and I go back to when we were in college. We both played football at Stanford. He's from this area. I was down from Maryland. We were both recruited by the same individual. So, they recruited by region. He's, I I think 2 years behind me, and he was on offense and I was on defense. So I didn't, offenses and defensive don't interact on a football team, frankly. And so it's not like he and I were like hanging out, playing pool. Like we barely, if ever, spoke to each other. So while we will claim a friendship that going back decades, the fact is, we weren't interacting when we were in college. Now, I was certainly paying attention to him because he was clearly on some sort of different path. By the time I was in grad school, I think he was student body president or something like that in college. And then he goes off to get a Rhodes Scholarship. And then he goes to Yale Law School, and I was just wrapping up my residential component of my career as a grad student at Yale. So we didn't interact there, but I kept hearing about Cory Booker. Have you met this guy, Cory Booker? I'm like, well, we played football together. So I've been following Cory and his accomplishments for decades now. And it was really quite a lovely thing that the day I was introduced to the Rutgers community, I had a message from the head of government relations at Rutgers saying, Senator Booker wants to get in touch with you. Can we give him your cell phone? I'm like, yeah, that's fine. And so a few hours after my introduction, my phone rings and it's, and I knew that I was told to be this number. So I'm like, that's, wow. So I'm in the hotel room and my wife there and my parents-in-law were there. I'm like, hello, Senator. And they're like, hush. So he's been great. And he stepped out of some live hearing to give me a 2-minute phone call. And he and I have stayed in regular touch since then and really look to be great partners and to do great things for New Jersey together.
Yeah, small world, really small world. So since you're in New Jersey now, do you think how do you find Jersey, especially? Because I think you've traveled a lot during your life. I'm not sure if this is the first time you've been to Jersey. How do you find
Well, I grew up in Maryland. My wife and I grew up in Maryland, so we were up and down through Jersey all the time. So my notion of New Jersey was the Turnpike and Garden State, which is not fair. And my wife has family in South Jersey. I have family in North Jersey. So we have different kinds of roots here, not personal roots. But New Jersey, for me, one, it feels very familiar because I grew up in the DC area. It's just a few hours away. It's the same plants, it's the same flora and fauna, feels the same. However, I've never lived in the state. And now it's strange because I'm in a little bubble. Like I rarely am by design, I'm rarely in my university office. I'm mostly in the house. Rutgers has an inventory of over 1,000 buildings. I've been in 9 of them. And this is all because of COVID, right? Mm-hmm. I haven't laid eyes on the Camden campus, although I've been there virtually at least a half a dozen times already. I've been in the Newark campus. That's when I got to go into a couple buildings just because I needed a place to sit down for some online meetings I was having while I was up there. So I barely know New Jersey. And in fact, my wife and youngest child, he's a senior in high school. So they were in Evanston, Illinois, so he can finish high school until the pandemic just brought them here the last month because his high school's gone remote. But until they moved here, I would work in my house, work in my office, eat meals in the kitchen, work out in the basement. And that was it. That was all of New Jersey for me until I ran out of food and I'd go to Trader Joe's on Route 1 and the pet store to get food for the pets. That was all I could tell you of New Jersey. So it's a work in progress. I mean, I've barely been anywhere. I'm eager to get out and see different parts, especially with the really beautiful areas that I've heard about. But, I was thinking, oh, well, I'll go here and get dinner. But I'm like, and what, eat it in my car? I mean, there's just I'm in Piscataway in the president's house for the time being.
There's beautiful hiking areas too.
I've heard.
Nearby. Yeah. There's a lot of good places. Do you think that there's a joke going around in New Jersey that Central Jersey does not exist? And since your short time being here, what's your perspective on that? It's a really important question.
The only Jersey I know is Central Jersey. So yes, it
exists. There it is. We all heard it, ladies and gentlemen. It has been confirmed by the American historian himself.
That's right.
No, we appreciate your time here, President Holloway. And I guess we'll leave off with, if you have anything to say or anything to say, last remarks, feel free to take the floor before we leave off with you.
Oh, well, first of all, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun, wide-ranging conversation. The thing I'll end with is that, look, this is a hard time for everybody. I don't care what your circumstances are. It's just hard. For me, though, I was hired to be an externally facing president, like to be out and about, meeting the alumni no matter where they were. And for those people in New Brunswick, since that's where my office is headquartered, like being seen, being out on campus, going to student events, doing things. And all the things I was hired to do have to be done remotely, or have to be done virtually now. So that's a challenge for me personally. But when we are back in action, I really do hope and expect that students will be reaching out and and inviting me to things, and just as you invited me to do this podcast, but to things in person. My calendar is a challenge, but the more I get to interact with students, the more hyped I'm about being at Rutgers. So help me help you. That's what I wanted, a message for the future for anybody at the Rutgers undergraduate level or student level who's trying to figure out who this guy is.
Are you rah?
Yes.
There you go.
Thank you, President Holloway. We appreciated our meeting with you.
My pleasure.
It's been a pleasure, an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
Good luck with your finals coming up around the corner here.
Oh, God.
Thank you.
Sorry. Just good luck. Just good luck.
We appreciate it.